Chapter 1. Mildred looked at Berta and shook her head. What are you going to do? You sent a letter to Connor in Idaho. What are you going to do when he mails your train ticket? She couldn't believe her friend was going to just not show up for the man who was supposed to be her husband. Millie had gone with Berta to a mail-order bride agency over a month before, but Berta had since changed her mind. Millie was unsure how anyone could do something so selfish, but Berta seemed to think that her happiness was the only thing that was important at all. Berta shrugged. I have no idea what to do. How was I supposed to know Harvey would come back and want to marry me? She raised her hands palm up as if to say she had no choice in the decision she made. Millie couldn't believe how selfish her friend was being. Poor Connor O'Reilly had sent off for a mail-order bride, and he should by God have a mail-order bride coming to him. Let's go talk to Elizabeth Miller. Maybe there's time to send him a letter before he sends out your train tickets. She would do whatever she could to make up for her friend's error. She didn't know why, but she'd always felt she should right the wrongs of others. She was good at it, and she hated knowing people were upset with one another. Berta nodded. All right, but I have to be home by 4. I need to have time to cook Harvey a good supper before he gets home from work. Harvey, Berta's new husband, worked at the hotel Millie's father owned. Millie thought about everything she knew about Connor O'Reilly, her heart hurting for him. He was an Irish immigrant who had lived in Idaho for 5 years. He'd worked hard and started his own hotel and restaurant. His letter requested a wife who knew how to cook well so she could help with the restaurant. She couldn't get the poor man out of her mind as they walked toward Elizabeth's home. Berta could not stop talking about Harvey. He's so caring and considerate. Why, just last night he took off his shoes so he wouldn't trample any more mud on my freshly washed floors. He tried to keep me from having a lot of work. Her voice was filled with love as she talked about the husband she thought was absolutely perfect. Millie shook her head, noting that Berta hadn't said he'd cleaned up the floors he'd already tracked mud on. She'd never been a big fan of Harvey's, but her friend already knew that, and she wasn't going to start a fight by saying anything. Berta's biggest shortcoming, to Millie's way of thinking, was her blind spot where Harvey land was concerned. They finally reached Elizabeth's house, and Berta gripped Miley's hand tightly, obviously nervous about telling Elizabeth what she'd done. A blond man came to the door, just as he had every other time they'd come. He let them in and led them through the house to Elizabeth, who was sitting at her desk. He cleared his throat, and she turned smiling. Oh, Berta. I was just about to come see you. She nodded to Mildred, who had come with her on her previous visit. Your letter came today. She looked to the butler. Tea and cookies, Bernard? Bernard nodded, and closed the door behind him as he left. Once he had, Elizabeth turned to Berta with a smile, handing her a letter. Berta stared down at it as if she were afraid it would burn her. She looked at Millie imploringly, as if she were trying to get her to do her talking for her. Millie sighed. She eloped last week. It was all I could do to drag her here to tell you today. I hoped we could get a letter to him before he spent the money on a train ticket. She was annoyed that Berta wouldn't even talk about what had happened herself, and instead, Millie had to explain it all. Why wasn't her friend more responsible? Elizabeth's face fell. Do you know this has never happened to me? I'm not sure what to do. Millie took the letter and opened it. Well, hopefully he said he didn't want her to come and that you need to keep looking. She read the letter quickly as a train ticket fell into her lap. Dear Berta, you sound like the woman I've been waiting my entire life for. I can't wait to have you here with me so we can build our lives together. I've enclosed a train ticket that will leave Beckham on Monday, and you'll arrive here in Idaho approximately 10 days later. I know it will be a long trip, but I'll be waiting for you at the train station. I am tall with red hair. I can't wait to see you. Adoringly, Connor. She read the letter once more, before setting it down carefully. Your train leaves Monday. She sighed. Now what do we do? Millie looked between Elizabeth and Berta, hoping one of them would come up with a viable solution, but they both simply stared back at her. Elizabeth looked back and forth between the two women. Can you cook? She asked, looking at Millie. Millie frowned. Was Elizabeth suggesting she go in her friend's place? She'd always lived in a home where servants took care of all of her needs. She'd tried to cook once or twice, but always with the family's cook standing over her. She could probably do it though. It was just following a bunch of recipes, wasn't it? Besides, she needed an adventure. I enjoy cooking, Millie said. It wasn't exactly a lie. She'd enjoyed it the few times she'd done it. Would you consider? Elizabeth couldn't even finish the sentence. Slowly Millie nodded. I think that's a good idea. He'll get a wife, and I'll go out west. I always thought I'd do better there than here anyway. From what she'd heard, people in the West appreciated strong women, and Millie was strong. She knew she was able to do a lot to help others, and she was determined to make a difference. Out west was where she belonged. She just knew it. Berta looked at Millie in shock. You can't go. Millie frowned at Berta. We promised the man a wife. He paid a lot of money for that train ticket, and he deserves a wife. She tried to keep the anger at her friend out of her voice. She knew she was being unreasonable, but how could Berta not fulfill her promise? What was wrong with her? Your parents will never let you go. Millie just shrugged. Her parents had always let her do pretty much whatever she'd wanted to do. They'll be fine. If they weren't fine with it right away, she'd talk them into it. It wasn't like she would be marrying a man who was wanted by the law. He was an upstanding citizen who happened to own a hotel and restaurant. Her father couldn't help but approve. Elizabeth breathed a sigh of relief. Can you be ready to go in 3 days? I don't see why not. I have everything I could possibly need. It's just a matter of packing a few things. Once her mind was made up, Millie wasn't one to waste time. She'd go home and pack her things straight away. She was off for an adventure that would serve two purposes: making up for her friend's betrayal and getting out of Beckham. I'll meet you at the train station on Monday, then to see you off. What time does your train leave? Millie looked at the ticket. Noon. Unlike many young women her age, Millie had taken trains many times. Her family had traveled a great deal. Bernard came in then with a tray laden with tea and cookies. They sat and drank the tea, talking about what they knew about Idaho, which wasn't very much. I know they're trying to get statehood, but so far they haven't managed it, Berta said with a frown. For some reason, Berta had thought it was a great adventure when she was going, but now that it was Millie going to marry Connor, it was a frightening prospect. Millie took a sip of her tea. I'm certain it's just a matter of time. I mean, everyone around them is being granted statehood. Millie wasn't worried. She needed the change, needed the adventure. Her life was about to change, and she would do nothing to stop it. Elizabeth looked between the two women. Are your parents going to be upset about this? Oh no, Millie responded. They have my 3 younger sisters. They say I'm the most troublesome of the lot anyway. She shrugged. My father always calls me his little minx. She knew she was exaggerating a bit, but her parents usually let her do whatever she wanted to do. She smiled as she thought about spending long days with her husband, walking hand in hand with him. Her life would be good. She wouldn't settle for anything less. Asterisk. Millie waited until after dinner that evening to broach the subject of leaving with her parents. Her sisters had gone upstairs to play, and she cornered her parents in the parlor where her father was reading a newspaper and her mother was knitting. It was their usual way to spend an evening together. Neither of them would speak at all unless one of their daughters came into the room. Her mother looked up at her. "May I talk to you both?" Millie asked politely, taking the spot beside her mother on the sofa against one wall of the room. Her father sat in an armchair perpendicular to the sofa. Millie sat between them both. "What do you need?" her father asked, his voice harsh, but it didn't bother Millie. That was just his way. "I've agreed to move out west as a mail-order bride," Millie told them, preferring to get hard tasks over with quickly. She sat quietly looking from her father to her mother to see who would speak first. Probably her mother, because she tended to get more upset over Millie's schemes than her father did. Her mother gaped at her. "A mail-order bride? You can't just leave to be a mail-order bride. I'll be going to Idaho territory to marry a man who owns a hotel and restaurant. His name is Connor." Millie continued speaking as if her mother had never said anything, knowing that if her father agreed, her mother would agree. It was how their marriage worked. Mr. Barrington carefully folded his paper and put it on the coffee table in front of him, watching his eldest daughter carefully. She'd never shown much interest in marriage, although she'd attended all the parties they'd insisted she attend. "Why?" he asked. Millie took a deep breath, knowing that her answer to this question would be the only thing he would take into consideration. "I've read a lot of books about the West, and I find it fascinating. There are no men here that I'm interested in, and I'm already 22 years old. It's time I marry, as you've told me many times. This opportunity has presented itself, and I think it's time I do the adult thing and forge my own destiny." She deliberately left out the part about it being Berta who had actually answered the letter. Her father looked at her as if he were trying to discern whether she was lying by the look on her face. "Are you certain that's what you want?" he asked. She nodded, not at all certain, but knowing she needed to make a change. There was a restlessness inside her that couldn't be addressed while she lived here with her family. She needed this with everything inside her, and she was suddenly thankful to Berta for backing out of the marriage and giving her this opportunity. "Yes, Father. It's not only what I want. It's what I need." Nothing was said for well over a minute while her father thought about his decision. She'd had enough experience with him that she knew he was trying to decide what he should say, so she remained silent, knowing speaking to him further about it would only delay his decision. Finally, he gave a brief nod. "When will you leave?" His words gave Millie permission to carry out her plans, and she knew it. She felt her mother tense up beside her, but she knew that the hard part was over. If her father agreed, then she could go. It was as simple as that. Millie let out a breath she hadn't even realized she'd been holding. "I have a train ticket leaving out of Beckham at noon on Monday. You'll need to have everything ready before then, and that's going to be a chore." He picked his newspaper up again and began reading, although he lowered it after a moment. "Just remember you have a home to come back to if things don't work out with your Connor." "Thank you, Father." Millie could see by the look on her mother's face that she didn't approve of her father's decision, but as usual, she didn't argue with him. She never had, and she never would. As far as Sylvia Barrington was concerned, a man's home was his castle and his wife was his to command. It was a philosophy that she hadn't been able to pass on to her headstrong eldest daughter. Millie stood and walked toward the doorway. "I'll go upstairs and start sorting through my things now." She practically skipped from the room as she rushed up the stairs to start packing. She was really going to move to Idaho and marry a total stranger. Why was she so excited at the prospect? As she walked toward the stairs, Millie heard, "Are you sure you're doing the right thing, Gus? Don't worry about her, Sylvia. She'll come home if there are any problems. Our little Minx can take care of herself." Millie smiled at the words of praise and ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time. She loved it when her father called her his Minx. She didn't know why the word felt like such an endearment to her, but it did. She entered the room she shared with her sister, Carrie, and told her quickly what she'd done. "Will you help me pack?" Carrie stared at her sister in awe. "You've lost your mind, Millie." Millie shrugged. "I've been feeling like I needed to do something crazy for a long time. This may be just what I need." She stood up and got 2 large carpet bags out from under the bed she shared with Carrie. "I need to decide what to take and what to leave. I won't have room for all of my clothes, and I doubt if Father would agree to ship them all." Millie ignored her sister's shocked look and set about accomplishing her task. If she had help, that would be wonderful. If not, she'd do it herself. She was determined. Carrie got to her feet and helped, and the 2 of them worked well into the night. It was Friday, and they only had 2 days to get her ready. Millie was a little nervous, but very excited. She was going to get married. Asterisk. Millie spent all day Saturday at Berta's house having her friend give her some very basic cooking lessons. Berta kept shaking her head. "He's not going to be happy when he realizes you can't even fry an egg," she finally said after hours of working with Millie, who had yet to fry an egg without leaving a huge piece of shell in with the egg. Millie shrugged. "I'll be a good wife in other ways." She couldn't imagine the man actually getting angry with her for not being able to cook. What kind of husband would do such a thing? Do you really think he'll care? How could any man look at her and say she wasn't good enough for what he needed? She had always had boys surrounding her trying to catch her attention. Surely Connor would be like all the others. When he realized how good she was at helping people, he'd forgive her for not being able to cook. Berta looked at Millie in disbelief. "He wants someone who can cook for his restaurant. Of course, he'll care. I'm taking recipes with me. I'll figure them out." Millie refused to be concerned about it. She was a pretty woman, and many men had been interested in her. Besides, they could always hire someone to cook. Asterisk. Connor O'Reilly was getting more excited every day. His new wife would be there in less than 2 weeks. He flipped the sign in the restaurant from open to closed and went through the lobby of the hotel to climb the stairs to his room. Someday he'd have the money to buy a home and not have to live in one of the rooms in the hotel, but that day was not today. He looked forward to Berta's arrival. It would be easier with someone else to share the cooking burden with him. Finding front desk help had always been easy. Finding a cook had eluded him. He smiled as he thought about the bride he was waiting for. He didn't care about beauty. What he cared about more than anything was having a sweet wife who could cook. He needed a woman who would be biddable, do as she was told, and be willing to work as much as possible. Was that too much to ask? Sweet Berta sounded like all those things were just what she was looking for, so he was looking forward to finally meeting her. He looked around the tiny room he lived in. He left the nicer rooms for the paying customers, who he could charge a little more for the nice room. He and Berta would take the tiny room. The bed was big enough for 2. That and the dresser were all they really needed. They would share the bathroom down the hall with the hotel's other guests and be thankful they had one. When his sweet bride finally arrived, he would celebrate like no man had ever celebrated. He had a wedding planned for the afternoon of her arrival, and he'd even arranged to close down the restaurant for a day. To take a full day off was a true celebration. He hoped his Berta was suitably grateful. He sighed, climbing into bed fully clothed and lying on his back with his hands folded behind his head. What more could a man ask for in life? A good business that he owned, a good wife, and someday beautiful children. Yes, he'd done the right thing by sending off for a bride, and he didn't care what anyone thought of it. Chapter 2. Millie went to the train station a half hour early on Monday, knowing that Elizabeth would be meeting her there. Her mother had offered to go with her, but she'd said her goodbyes at the house, knowing she would rather break free. She didn't know what was wrong with her because she had a good life, but for months, all she'd been able to think about was leaving and never returning. She looked over the people mingling around the station and saw Elizabeth sitting on one of the seats with an empty seat on either side of her. Millie walked over to sit with the other woman. "I'm ready to go." She couldn't keep the grin off her face. She was about to be a married woman. "Do you have your ticket?" Elizabeth asked. Millie held up the ticket. "And I have plenty of money for food on the train, and books to read, and everything else my mother was certain I would need." She grinned at Elizabeth. "At least you know she cares. Now before I send a bride out, I do a quick background check on each man, and I find out as much as I can. Connor checked out just fine, so there should be no problems. If there are, come home." Elizabeth looked like she was concerned, and Millie couldn't help but wonder why. Millie nodded. "My parents have already told me the same thing." Elizabeth smiled. "You have smart parents. Have you ever had a woman go out to marry a bad man?" Millie asked. "Only once. There were two men with the same name in a relatively large city, and I investigated the wrong one. The bride was treated very poorly, but thankfully, she didn't marry the man she set out to marry. She married a random stranger instead, and did very well for herself. I'm not one to stay in a bad situation." She didn't mention the wad of money she had hidden on her either. Some was in her shoes. Some was in each of her bags. She even had some tucked into the bodice of her dress. A small amount was in her purse, ready for her to purchase meals along her journey. She was as ready as she would ever be to spend 10 days on trains. "Write to me when you get there so I know you're safe, please." Elizabeth always asked the same two things of all the women she sent west. "Please don't stay if the situation is bad, and please write and let me know if you're safe." "I will. Right after I write my parents and Berta." Millie knew she would write the other two first, and she wasn't about to lie to Elizabeth and say she'd be getting the first letter from her. Elizabeth frowned at the mention of Berta's name. "Thank you for stepping in for Berta. I can't believe she just eloped that way. I've needed to get out of Beckham for a while. All the same men. All the same women. I feel like I'm going crazy doing the same thing day in and day out. I need a change. Badly." She shook her head. Her parents had always had money, and they refused to let their children work. She felt like her life had been wasted as she did only the things they approved of, none of which had been very helpful. Elizabeth nodded. "I felt the same way before I took over the mail-order bride agency from Harriet Long. I thought I was the only one to ever feel this way." Millie sighed. "Thank you." She felt much better knowing she wasn't the only one with feelings of inadequacy. "Well, you're not. I hope you enjoy Idaho territory. From what I've read, it's very beautiful. You won't have the ocean close by, of course, but you will have the mountains." "Mountains sound so beautiful to me." Millie looked at Elizabeth with surprise. "You've never been to the mountains?" She had traveled more extensively than most young women, but she assumed Elizabeth had traveled as well. The other girl obviously had wealth with the home she lived in. Elizabeth shook her head. "My parents barely had enough money to feed us all, let alone take us to the mountains." Millie was almost ashamed at that moment of her privileged upbringing. "We went to either the ocean for a week or to the mountains for a week every summer. I love the mountains." Her sisters had all preferred their ocean vacations, but she'd preferred the mountains. "I've only seen photographs." "You'll have to come visit me then." Millie didn't know how her new husband would react to the invitation, but hopefully he wouldn't mind. It was going to be interesting to have to work alongside a man every day. She'd never been one to do what was expected of her, and she hoped her husband was expecting someone who could think for herself. The conductor called for everyone to get on the train then, and Millie got to her feet. "Thank you for all your help making this happen," she said to Elizabeth as she hugged her tightly. "Just stay safe. Have a wonderful life. I hope he's everything you've imagined." "Oh, he will be. If he wasn't, she'd just help him become the man she needed to be. She was good at that sort of thing after all." Millie hurried toward the train and climbed the steps. In her mind, she was climbing the mountain that led her to her new home and the man who would love her beyond belief. Who would kiss her hands and tell her she was the most wonderful woman in the world every day. She couldn't wait. Asterisk. Connor stood nervously waiting for his sweet Berta. He looked out over the small crowd looking for the girl who had described her hair as the color of autumn leaves. He couldn't wait to hug her and kiss her and welcome her to Idaho, the land of promise. His heart pounded in his chest at the idea of meeting his beautiful bride. The whole town, if you could call Gullet Gulch a town, was excited for him. Most of the shops in town would be closed as people were all going to be attending his wedding. His wedding with Miss Berta Wyatt, his new bride and cook for Connor's restaurant. He sighed happily as a woman stopped in front of him. Her hair wasn't the color of autumn leaves, though. Who was this? "Are you Connor O'Reilly?" Millie couldn't keep the smile off her face as she asked. Connor was an extremely handsome man, something she hadn't expected at all. He nodded, his face skeptical. "You don't look like my Berta, though." Who was this woman and where was his Berta? She smiled sweetly. "I'm not Berta. I'm her best friend, Mildred, but everyone calls me Millie." She held her hand out for him to shake, and he took it automatically, surprised that she was there. "Where's my Berta?" The confusion on his face was obvious to anyone who looked. He wanted his bride, and she wasn't there. Was she still on the train? Millie sighed. "You know, all this way, I've been hoping you wouldn't ask." "Is there somewhere we can sit, so I can explain?" she asked. She hated having to be the one to explain that her friend had chosen to marry someone else. Connor took her bags from her, carrying them like the gentleman he was, as he looked over the crowd, hoping to see Berta's hair somewhere. Where was his bride, and who was this woman? "We can go to the park. There is a bench there across from the fountain." He didn't know where else to take her, because the restaurant was closed for his wedding. His wedding that apparently had no bride to attend. Oh, a fountain? I love fountains. She'd make a wish on it. Maybe he would fall in love with her, and the look of disappointment over her not being Berta would eventually go away. She'd been sure he'd take one look at her and be satisfied that he'd gotten a good woman, but it just wasn't working out how she'd expected it to. The park was a short walk, just across Main Street. It was a small park with a few benches and a beautiful fountain in the middle. People claimed the fountain had been brought over from England, but Connor wasn't certain he believed that. He led her to a bench, where he sat down, putting the bags on the ground at his feet. It was a good thing it was summer, because in the winter, he'd have lost them in the snow. Millie didn't sit down, and instead, she chose to pace the ground in front of him. "I was with Berta when she first read your letter to the mail-order bride agency. Her beau had just left town, you see, and she thought he'd jilted her, but he really left town to make his fortune." She did her best to explain, but she knew her thoughts were a bit scattered on the subject. Connor made a face at the idea of his sweet Berta having a beau before him. He didn't like that idea at all. "I see. Well, when Harvey came back to town, he had no fortune, but my father offered him a job at his hotel, so he took it, and then he had a way to support Berta, so they eloped. Your letter came in a week after they were married." She was still pacing and didn't see the sad expression cross his face. "So because you had sent a train ticket, but she couldn't come marry you, I said I'd come in her place. I need to marry, and I wanted to move to where I could see mountains every day. She nodded off into the distance, where the mountains rose majestically over the small town. She looked at him, hoping he wouldn't reject her and send her back to Beckham. Of course, even if he tried, she wouldn't go. Connor blinked a few times. So you are my substitute bride? Why would she just assume he would marry her? Of course, he was certain he would. He just had to get used to the idea. She nodded, her face lighting up with excitement that the hard part of the day was over. She'd explained everything to him, and he was all right with it. He was a handsome man, and she hated disappointing him that way, but at least he got a wife, right? Connor sighed. I guess I don't really have a choice in the matter. She wasn't what he'd been imagining as he went to sleep every night. Instead, she was just a pretty girl. Beauty didn't matter to him, though. Do you cook? Millie nodded. I do. She didn't add the words very badly, but she should have. She wasn't much of a cook, after all. She would learn though. And she had a cookbook. How hard could it be? She thought about the eggshells that she'd cooked every time while Berta had been teaching her, but immediately dismissed the memory. Now was the time to rejoice over her marriage to this man. Connor got to his feet and walked to her, looking her up and down. She was pretty, and he was attracted to her. She wasn't Berta, but did that really matter? He'd never met her, and she was married to another man anyway. Well, I guess we're getting married then. Do you want to change first? Take a bath? We have a bathroom down the hall from our room at the hotel. Oh, do you live out of town? We're staying in the hotel tonight? It hadn't occurred to her they'd live out of town since he had to work in it. He shook his head. No, I live at the hotel. We'll share a room there. Eventually, we'll be able to buy a house, but it won't be this week. It wouldn't even be that year, but he didn't add that. It would be just as soon as he could make it happen. Millie tried not to let her opinion of that show. Well, a bath would be nice before the wedding. Thank you. She looked over at the fountain he'd mentioned for a moment. Is it all right if I make a wish on the fountain first? It was a beautiful fountain, rising majestically over the park. She'd never seen anything like it, and she found herself drawn to it. He looked at her for a moment before shrugging. He had no idea why she wanted to wish on it, but if it made her happy, she was welcome to do it. I guess. I don't know if anyone's ever wished on it, but if that's what you want to do. He was beginning to realize that Millie wouldn't be nearly as easily dealt with as he'd imagined Berta would be. Had she not been raised to know that a man was the head of his household? She stepped closer to the fountain, placing her palms flat on it. It feels like I should wish on it. Are you sure people don't wish on this thing? She glanced at him over her shoulder, wondering why he'd never wished on it. She felt compelled to do so, wanting to instantly make a wish that she fully expected to be granted. Honestly, I have no idea. Closing her eyes tightly, she wished silently. I wish that I could make a real difference in Connor's life and that he won't be angry when he finds out I can't cook, and he'll fall in love with me anyway. She smiled at him. You should wish too. She felt better after making her wish, as if she knew it would be granted. He shrugged, playing along with her. He put his palms flat on the fountain and closed his eyes as she had. I wish that this beautiful girl beside me will be as sweet and loving as I'd imagined Berta to be. He looked at her. I wished. Would she be satisfied with that? Or would she ask about his wish? What did you wish for? She asked. She grinned up at him mischievously, hoping he'd tell her. She needed to know what was most important to this man she was about to marry. He laughed. What did you wish for? I can't tell you. My wish wouldn't come true. He laughed. Wishes don't come true anyway. This one will. She put her hand through his arm and smiled up at him. You'll see. As he led her toward the hotel, he said, I don't even know your full name. He was marrying a woman whose name he didn't even know. What was he thinking? Well, it's Mildred and Barrington. I didn't bother with my last name because it'll be O'Reilly in a couple of hours anyway. She shrugged, indicating her old name no longer mattered to her in any way. He looked at her in surprise. She certainly was not lacking in self-confidence. What would you have done if I hadn't been willing to accept you instead of Berta? He'd briefly considered sending her back where she came from, and he was surprised that she hadn't considered that possibility. She shrugged. I would have stayed in town and tried to convince you otherwise, of course. I guess I didn't think about that a whole lot. I just loved the adventure of traveling all this way by myself. She didn't add that if he couldn't find a wife, there were probably dozens of other men in need of wives too. She could have found one of them as well. He was surprised at her attitude, but couldn't deny he was attracted to a competent woman. She would be good for him. He led her to his room down at the end of the long hallway. Millie swallowed hard when she saw the tiny space. He expected her to live in there? The room was much smaller than the room she'd shared with her sister, Carrie. She put her bags down on the bed and thought about the tiny space she would be sharing with this man. She had a great deal of money that her grandfather had left for her, and she'd brought it all. Would he let her use her own money to buy a house? She decided to wait until after the wedding to ask him that. I'll just use the pitcher and bowl, she told him as she waited for him to leave. She looked at him, and he stood with his back against the door. Well, I can't wash and change with you watching. Why didn't he just leave? Connor flushed and left the room, closing the door behind him. He paced the halls while he waited for her. For a moment, he'd hoped she would undress in front of him, but she hadn't. Instead, she'd looked at him like he was crazy. They'd be married in just a few hours. What would it have mattered if he'd watched her change? He shook his head, knowing she'd done the right thing, but he didn't want to admit it. She was a beautiful woman, and he was more than a little attracted to her. Millie removed her dress, but left her petticoat on as she quickly washed. Connor seemed nice enough, but he hadn't been as excited by the switch as she'd hoped. Of course, he'd never heard of her, so maybe that was why. He couldn't look at Berta and then at her and realize that he'd gotten a good deal, could he? When she was dressed in her wedding clothes and had her hair fixed, she opened the door for him and found him pacing the halls. I'm ready. She wondered if there would be food involved with the wedding, because she needed a real meal and not just train sandwiches. She had eaten so many sandwiches during her week and a half on the train she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to stomach another. Connor looked at his bride with her hair fixed properly and a pretty, clean dress on. She was beautiful. He swallowed hard. She'd cleaned up very well. He glanced at his pocket watch. The wedding starts in half an hour. We should head over to the church. He was already in his church clothes for the wedding, so he was ready. He couldn't believe he'd gotten such a beautiful woman. He wouldn't be complaining that Berta hadn't shown up. She nodded regally, taking his arm and walking with him. His reaction to her was more like what she'd expected when she'd gotten off the train. Of course, she'd been rather dirty and her hair had been falling out of its perfect knot. Now she looked more like herself. They walked through the streets of the quiet town. The small crowd from the train had dissipated. How often does the train come through here? Just once per day. That's our busiest time of day at the restaurant. We expect to have a rush of people for about an hour before and an hour after. It always comes at noon, so people eat lunch while they're in town either picking someone up or dropping someone off. Even on Sundays? She asked with surprise. He nodded. The pastor has service at 8 on Sundays for those of us who are needed at the restaurant. I usually go in and prep before service, and then I hurry over after and get everything cooked up just as fast as I can. Millie had never really considered just how much work it would be to run a restaurant. They needed to find someone to cook for them fast, but she didn't say it. She just walked along beside him. There was already a small crowd at the church. "Did you invite people to the wedding?" she asked, not really sure what to expect. "Oh, yes. The whole town was invited. I even shut down the restaurant for the whole day." He said it as if it wasn't something he did often. Millie frowned, not liking the idea of life being endless work. What had she been thinking moving across the country? She stopped walking for a moment, taking deep gulping breaths. Did he ever take time off? Would she be expected to work every single day just as he did? Connor realized Millie had disappeared and turned to find her. She was standing with her hand on her stomach, taking deep breaths. "Are you all right?" he asked, his hand immediately going to her upper arm. She nodded. I guess it just hit me that this is forever." Connor watched her carefully. "Do you want to back out?" Millie realized there was nothing in the world she wanted as much as she wanted to back out of her wedding just then. Why had she thought she could go through with this? She wasn't used to second-guessing herself, so she concentrated on breathing deeply and getting her thoughts under control. The word panic simply wasn't part of her vocabulary. She shook her head. "I'll be all right. I just need a minute." When she finally had control of herself again, she took his arm. "I'm ready." But she knew she wasn't. She hoped she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her life. The wedding only took 10 minutes. It went way too fast for Millie. She had no idea what would happen after. Would he take her right back to the hotel to consummate the marriage? Her mother had told her how that worked, and it hadn't sounded pleasant. Would they have a small party to celebrate the wedding? Would they eat? She really hoped they'd eat. The minister pronounced them man and wife. "You may now kiss the bride." Connor smiled at her and lowered his head to hers, brushing his lips briefly across hers. Millie shivered at his touch, but not in a bad way. She liked it. She'd been kissed before. She'd been kissed by 3 different boys back home, but not one of them had made her feel like her belly was tingling or sent shivers through her body. Not until Connor had kissed her. She wanted to ask him to kiss her again, but they had an audience. Could she drag him out behind the church and kiss him? Or should she just wait and eat lunch first? "I now present to you Mr. and Mrs. O'Reilly," the pastor called out to the assembled crowd. Everyone swarmed around them almost immediately. She could tell that Connor was a much-loved member of their town. She lost track of the people she met, but they were all friendly to her. There were many more men than women, but she'd heard it was like that all through the West. After 5 minutes or so of introductions, Connor asked, "Are you hungry?" She nodded eagerly, hoping there would be food waiting for her, and he wouldn't ask her to cook. "Very. I've spent the last 10 days eating sandwiches. Lots and lots of sandwiches." She had to eat, and she needed to do it soon. She was surprised he hadn't heard her stomach growling at him through the ceremony. She felt like it had been terribly loud. Connor made a face. "I like sandwiches, but not for every meal for days in and days out." He slipped his arm around her waist and led her to the back of the church. "My friend's wife, Tabitha, is hosting a wedding party at her home. She'll have lots of food for us." They walked down the main street of the town toward the hotel. "Is everything in this town on this same street?" Millie asked. She was eager to get to know her new home. "Pretty much. There's not much to it." "I can see that." Why she'd expected a thriving city like Beckham, she had no idea. Maybe because living anywhere else in the world seemed odd to her. She liked the quiet atmosphere of the town, though, and hoped that the constant people coming into town for the train would make it seem like it was a bit larger. They stopped just before the hotel, and he led her up the walk to a medium-sized house, made entirely of wood. Before they even reached the door, it was flung open and Millie found herself grabbed in a big hug. "You must be Berta. I've been dying to meet you after Connor has told us so much about you." Millie shook her head. "Berta eloped. I'm Millie. I came in her place." She smiled sweetly, hoping the woman wouldn't ask any more questions. Tabitha stood back for a moment, looking shocked. "So you're the substitute wife?" "I'm the only wife. I suppose I was a substitute fiancé, though." Millie sincerely hoped that she wouldn't always be seen as the substitute. That would be unacceptable for a woman like her. Chapter 3. The wedding party was a potluck and many women from the area had brought covered dishes, so there was a huge variety of food on offer. For the first few minutes, Millie pretty much concentrated on food and ignored the people around her unless they spoke to her directly. The variety of food amazed her. There were obviously a lot of people in the area who were first generations out of Europe, and from many different lands, so the food was more cultural than she was used to back in Beckham. She had fried chicken, Irish stew, and lutefisk. She wasn't feeling particularly picky, just hungry, so she ate some of everything. She worried for a moment that Connor would think she was eating too much, but she decided she didn't care. She was hungry, and she was going to eat her fill. When the wedding cake was brought out, she glanced at Connor, who had been at her side the entire time. "The cake is beautiful." She'd never seen anything like it. It was 3 layers with tiers set up between them. He smiled. "That I made myself." She stared at it in shock. "Why don't you have a bakery?" She could see that he would be a very good baker if the cake tasted even half as good as it looked. He shrugged. "There was no way to make a living with a bakery here, but I could make a living with a hotel and restaurant. So I did what I needed to do." It made perfect sense to him. He could move to a large city where he wouldn't be as happy and run a bakery, or he could live in Gullet's Gulch and do something he liked less. "You should at least sell baked goods from the restaurant. Extra pies for people to take home." He looked at her and nodded slowly. "I hadn't thought of that, but I might need to." The more he watched her, the more he was glad that this girl had come and not the one he was expecting. He'd had an image in his head of what his perfect wife would be like, and Berta was it. Now that he'd spent some time with Millie, he thought maybe she was the one he needed for his bride, and not Berta. Maybe God had been watching out for him. They got up to cut the cake together and fed each other one bite with their forks. It was slightly embarrassing for her, with everyone watching, but she did enjoy being close to Connor. The party went on for hours, with her speaking to a few people and everyone telling Connor how much they cared about him and how happy they wanted him to be. Millie was beginning to see just how much he meant to the people of his town. "How long have you lived here?" she finally asked. He smiled over at her, his hand reaching out for hers. "About 10 years. I opened my restaurant 8 years ago, and the hotel 6 years ago." He was proud of what he'd accomplished during his time there, and was happy to be able to share his life with his beautiful bride. "You're doing very well for yourself here." He seemed to fit in with this town better than she had in Beckham, and she'd lived there her entire 22 years. He nodded. "I love it here. I wouldn't go back to Ireland. Here, I have everything I need." He looked into her eyes. "In Ireland I had no wife. Here I have you. Someone who will keep me warm at night and work by my side all day. I'm glad you're here." He leaned over in his chair and kissed her softly, wanting her to understand just how much her presence meant to him. She caught the back of his head with her hand and kissed him back, her lips parting for his. She felt a warmth spread through her body from the top of her head to the tips of her toes that had nothing to do with the summer heat. When she heard the catcalls from across the room, she flushed and pulled away from him. "Can I help it if I married the most handsome man in Idaho territory?" she asked loudly. There was a lot of laughter, and Connor pulled her close to his side. "You're going to be a good wife to me. I'm going to do my very best." She felt badly that he didn't realize she couldn't cook yet, but she didn't want to ruin their wedding days with any depressing news. She'd wait. That kind of news was always better to wait on. Besides, as soon as he saw how good she was at helping the people around her, she was certain he'd be thrilled to have her for his wife. Connor finally looked over at her and squeezed her hand. "Are you ready to go? We have to be the first to leave, and some of the children look like they're getting sleepy." He didn't add that he couldn't wait any longer to take her into his arms and truly make her his wife. Looking at the wall clock, Millie could see it was almost 7. They had eaten most of the afternoon, with snacking here and desserts there. She was grateful no one would need to cook that evening. "I'm ready." Her eyes didn't meet his, though, because she felt that ready meant something very different than what he did. Her mother had talked to her about what to expect on her wedding night, and she was not looking forward to it. How could that possibly be comfortable? They stood, and Connor thanked everyone for coming, the Irish in his voice making Millie smile. "We'll see you all at the restaurant and at church on Sunday." They both waved to the others as they left the house, walking toward the hotel. When they were finally alone, she had no idea what to say to him. What did one say to a man she'd just met but who she was now married to? "Your friends are nice," she mumbled. Connor smiled. "They are. This whole town has invited me in and acted like I'm a long-lost son. It's a good place for me to be. I feel like I'm loved here." "What was your family like?" She'd never been out of the United States, so she had no idea what it would have been like growing up in Ireland. He shrugged. "I was the oldest of 8 children. 3 girls and 5 boys. Mida had a farm, and we all worked on it whenever we weren't in school. Mam had a small bakery that she ran out of the house. I would have preferred to work with Mam all the time, but Din needed me for the farm labor. In the evenings, after it was too dark to work outside, Mam would show me how to bake and decorate cakes." He smiled as he thought of the long hours in the kitchen with his mother. He knew it was odd that he preferred the baking to the farm work, but he'd been drawn to the kitchen his entire life. It sounds like it was a good way to grow up. She couldn't help but smile at the idea of him in a kitchen with his mother. He thought about that for a moment before saying, "It was the best. I wouldn't trade it for anything." He sighed. "I do wish my family could have come over here with me, but Mam said she was too old to go to some strange country and start over. I sometimes wish one of my brothers or sisters would travel over and settle near me, but they're marrying boys and girls from home one by one." "You miss them?" It was obvious by his tone of voice that he wanted to have his family around him again. He nodded. "I miss them every day. I made the right choice for me to come here and to start my own business. For them? The choice wasn't as great." He looked down at her as they entered the lobby of the hotel to go up to their rooms. "What about you? Did you come from a large family?" She shook her head. "Not as large as yours. There were 4 of us, all girls. I'm the oldest. So we're both the oldest of our family. Does that make us both bossy?" He grinned. "My brothers and sisters all said I was bossy because I was the oldest." "Oh, absolutely not. It makes us both more responsible than most." She grinned at him. When they got to their room, he used his key to unlock the door for her, and stopped. "I'll wait while you get ready for bed." She sighed. "I'd really like to take a bath tonight. Would that be all right?" He nodded, taking her down the hallway to the bathroom and showing her how the running water worked. "I'll get my nightgown first," she told him, blushing slightly. She'd never worn just a nightgown in front of a man. She was nervous about being alone with him, but he was her husband now. She needed to get over that feeling. They walked back to the bedroom, and she got her nightgown and dressing gown, along with her hairbrush, before rushing down the hall to take a bath. She wanted to spend hours relaxing in the bath, but realized that he wouldn't be thrilled with her for that. She needed to hurry and be with him as soon as possible. She rushed through her bath, washing her hair quickly. When she got out, she hurriedly brushed her hair before dressing and going back down the hall, her dirty clothes in her hands. He was waiting in the room for her, and jumped up when she entered. "I'll just go and get a quick bath too," he said, leaving her there to settle in. As he hurried down the hall, he thought about how pretty she had looked with her pink dressing gown and her hair down around her shoulders. She was a beautiful girl, and he couldn't wait to kiss her. When he returned to the room, she was sitting on the bed with her legs folded under her, brushing through her long hair. She carefully held each strand up as she brushed it, trying to get it to dry quickly. Her hair was long though, well past her waist, and he realized her arms must be getting tired. "May I help?" he asked. She looked at him with surprise. "You want to help me brush my hair?" She'd never heard of such a thing, but surely it was all right for him to help her. They were married after all. He nodded, moving around to sit behind her on the bed. She passed the brush to him over her shoulder and bent her head forward. Her sister had brushed her hair for her many times, as well as her mother. They hadn't been allowed to have personal maids in their house, because her mother had said it would turn them into spoiled brats, so she'd learned to do mostly for herself. He took the brush from her and ran it through her hair, holding up individual sections to dry it faster. "You have beautiful hair." She swallowed hard. It felt odd to let a man do something so personal for her. "Thank you." It felt good to have his hands on her hair. She wanted to lean back against him and give herself over to the sensation, but she didn't want to be too forward. "When it was all on top of your head, I had no idea it was so long. I don't think I've ever seen hair this long." She shrugged. "I've never had it cut. It's been trimmed to even the length, but it's never been cut." Her father had believed that all women should be able to sit on their hair, and hadn't allowed them to cut it at all. "It's truly glorious." He said nothing else, just breathing in her scent as he slowly dried her hair with his fingers. She let her head drop way forward, and just enjoyed the feel of his hands on her hair. She could have sat letting him brush it for hours, but she knew he would never agree to take so long. She was honestly surprised he was brushing it for her at all. She'd never heard of a man brushing a woman's hair for her. Finally, he got out of the bed and set the brush down on the dresser, returning to sit on the bed in front of her. "I think it's dry enough," he said, tilting her face up to his with an index finger under her chin. "Thank you. I truly enjoyed that. Brushing my hair is just one of those chores I have to go through every day, and you made it special." She'd never dreamed he'd do something so intimate for her and make it feel so good. He was going to be a good husband. She could feel it. He smiled, stroking her cheek. "We'll try to make everything in life special." He sighed happily. "I think one of the greatest gifts my parents gave me is the ability to find happiness in the smallest of things. If you're too poor to have a roof over your head, it means that you get to sleep under the beautiful canopy of stars God created for us. If you have no money for cake, you thank God for the bread you have. There's something that's good in every situation." He shrugged. "Tonight, I got to touch my beautiful bride by helping her with her hair. It was a gift you gave me, letting me do it." Millie smiled at him, reaching out to touch his cheek, which he had obviously shaven while he was in the bathroom. "You gave me a gift as well." She realized then that she'd made the right decision moving to Idaho. Her new husband was just what she needed in life. He was loving, and he saw the good in all situations. How could she help falling in love with a man like that? Chapter 4. Connor leaned forward and kissed Millie gently, his hand on her cheek, his other braced on the bed. He would go as slowly as his sweet bride needed this first time. Her lips fluttered against his, and he moved closer, needing to feel her against him. Millie liked kissing Connor, but she was certain she wouldn't like what came after the kissing. Her mother had explained that it was her duty as a wife, though, so she didn't pull away. When he did nothing more than kiss her, her lips parted under his, and he swept his tongue inside her mouth to tangle with hers. She wound her arms around his shoulders and kissed him back, her hands stroking the hard muscles of his arms under his shirt. He moved his hands to the belt of her dressing gown and undid it, pushing it off her shoulders. Moving his hands to the buttons at the front of her gown, he unbuttoned the top one, before her hands caught his. She pulled away from the kiss, looking into his eyes. "Not yet." "All right?" He nodded. "I can wait." Her nightgown was made of the finest linen, and it was obvious she was from a much wealthier background than he was. He hoped she had no complaints for the way he provided. He smoothed his hands over her shoulders and down her arms, moving them around to her back. His hands stroked her through her nightgown, doing his best to get her used to his touch. He didn't want her shying away from him, but he needed her to get used to him having free access to her body. She rose to her knees on the bed so she could get closer to him, her arms winding around him and stroking him through his shirt. She felt her breasts flattened against the hard wall of his chest, and she found she liked the feeling. She liked everything about touching him so far, but she was afraid of what would happen if she let him take her nightgown off. He kissed down the side of her neck to her shoulder, and pressed soft, quick kisses there. He inched the fabric of her nightgown to the side so he had access to more of her bare flesh, and he covered it all with kisses. She stroked her fingers through his hair, smiling as she touched him. His lips felt so good against her flesh she couldn't contain her enthusiasm. She wanted to kiss his shoulders and chest as well, but he had put the dress shirt he'd worn to their wedding back on after his bath. She moved her hands to the top buttons of his shirt and began liberating them from their holes. "Do you mind?" she asked. Connor shook his head, moving onto his knees as well so she would have better access. He watched her with her hands on his chest, unbuttoning his shirt, and was overwhelmed with all he felt for her. Never in his life had he done this with a woman, and here she was, eagerly unbuttoning his shirt. He'd been certain he would need to coerce her into making love with him, but he found she was a willing participant. Could he have found a more perfect wife for him? She pushed his shirt off his shoulders and came into contact with his bare chest, kissing a slow path across it. Her thumbs found his nipples, and she stroked them. She'd never seen a man with no shirt on before, and it felt strange to be touching him this way. Strange, but wonderful. He let out a low moan, and she looked up at him, wondering if she'd displease him somehow. The look of bliss on his face startled her. "You like it when I touch you." "I love it when you touch me. Your fingers against my bare skin is my idea of what heaven must be." She giggled softly. "I like touching you." She knew she probably wasn't supposed to admit that to him, but he was her husband. She wasn't about to hide her feelings from him. He kissed her again, sweetly, not trying to force his tongue into her mouth. "Is it okay if I touch you now?" he asked, his fingers plucking against the shoulders of her nightgown. She nodded, and while he unbuttoned her nightgown, she caught the hem of it. As soon as he was finished, she pulled it over her head and dropped it to the floor. He stared at her, a dazed expression on his face. One hand came up to cup her breast, and he stroked his thumb over the tip of it. "You are so beautiful." She quickly moved against him so her body would be hidden from his view as it was pressed against his. He stroked his hands over her back and down over her beautifully rounded bottom. He cupped her derriere in his hands, and she looked at him startled. "You're touching me everywhere." "Was that allowed?" He nodded. "I'm supposed to." He could tell she worried that they were doing something wrong, and he wanted to keep her from worrying. "You are?" Her mother had said nothing about that to her. He nodded evenly. "I'm your husband. I'm supposed to know your body as well as I know my own." "Am I supposed to know your body as well as I know mine?" She liked the idea of touching him everywhere. What had come over her that she was interested in touching a man's body this way? He nodded, hoping she'd take him at his word. Her hands immediately went to the waistband of his pants, unfastening them and pushing them down over his lean hips. She couldn't make herself look down as she removed them, not wanting to see the man part of him. Surely it was wrong for her to look at his bare body. She kissed him again, her hands roaming around to his backside and touching him there, cupping him in her hands. He took his pants the rest of the way off, and pushed her down to her back, his hands going to her thighs, caressing them softly. He moved his hand between them, his fingers finding her core. Kissing her softly, he caught her cries of surprise as he plunged one finger deep inside her, stroking her softly, trying to ignite the same kind of fire in her that he felt burning inside him. Afterward, he gathered her into his arms and held her close, raining kisses over her face. "That was the most incredible experience of my life," he whispered to her. She sighed, snuggling into him with her face buried in his neck. "It's not what I expected." She was embarrassed by how passionately she'd responded to him. She hadn't expected to like what they did in bed together nearly as much as she had. Connor pulled away, looking into her eyes. "What did you expect?" Millie shrugged. "The way my mother told it, the pain would be almost unbearable, and it would be just embarrassing. Instead, I barely noticed any pain, and, well, it was a little embarrassing, but not so much that I don't want to do it again tomorrow." "And the next day?" She blushed as he watched her grinning. He laughed, cupping her face in his hands and kissing her again. "That's why you're just the right woman for me." It was still dark when he woke her the next morning, and she groaned, wanting nothing more than to roll over and go back to sleep. He tore the covers off her and threw them on the floor, before getting out his pants and dressing quickly. She rolled out of bed and pulled her petticoat on. She fixed her hair and dressed, buttoning her shoes with sleepy eyes. "What time is it?" she asked grumpily. She'd never been a morning person, and this morning was no exception. "It's 5:30. We have to start the bread baking for the day, and get a couple of pies made. We open at 10:30, and there's a lot of cooking to be done." His voice was positively cheerful, making her want to throw something at his head, but she refrained, quietly getting ready for the day instead. She grumbled as she followed him out the door to the restaurant, which was connected to the hotel. Walking into the kitchen, she looked around with a smile. He had a good setup here, and she couldn't help but be impressed. Of course, she had no idea how to cook, so she would have to learn quickly. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, watching as he took down ingredients for bread. "Why don't you make us some scrambled eggs, bacon, and a pot of coffee?" "I can see you need coffee." He smiled at her as he said the words, letting her know that her morning grumpiness didn't bother him at all. She smiled as she pulled out a frying pan and found the eggs and bacon in a room filled with ice. She walked out, shivering as she rubbed her arms. "I've never made coffee," she told him. "Would you show me?" She didn't mind asking for the one little thing, because she was certain she could make the eggs. She'd done it over and over with Berta, and she was certain she was an expert now. Of course, she had never done it without leaving eggshells in with the eggs, but she'd be more careful this time. He raised an eyebrow at that, but showed her how to measure the coffee into the tin pot. "There. Now just set it on the stove and it'll cook." He watched her as she did as he told her, hoping that she was better in the kitchen than it looked like she was. What kind of woman didn't know how to make coffee? From what he could tell, every American had coffee with their breakfast every day of the week. He'd started a fire in the coal stove for her while she was getting the eggs and bacon and watched her as she laid the bacon in the still cold frying pan. He could see she hadn't done as much cooking as she'd let on. "The bacon will turn out better if you warm the pan up first," he said. He gave her the advice calmly, as if he didn't mind at all that she had no clue what she was doing, but he could see that she knew nothing about cooking. Why hadn't she simply told him the truth? Oh, all right. She took the bacon back out and set the pan on the stove, waiting for it to warm. While it was warming, she cracked several eggs into a bowl, having to keep fishing out egg shells. "Millie?" Connor's voice was soft, but demanding as he said her name. She nodded, afraid to look at him. "You said you cooked." "I didn't say I did it well." She bit her lip, looking down at the eggs that she'd already mangled beyond recognition. He sighed. "I'll teach you." He had never been so disappointed in his life. She'd seemed so perfect to him, and now he could see where her flaws lay. She couldn't cook. At all. He'd asked for a wife who was an experienced cook, because it's what he needed. How was he going to be able to make this work? "While I'm teaching you, I'm going to need for you to spend most of your time waiting tables. Do you mind taking orders from people and taking them their food?" There was no going back now. They were married, and he truly didn't think he'd not marry her if he'd known, but he did wish she'd have told him. She dashed a tear from her eye as she nodded. "I'm sorry. I was going to tell you, but I just couldn't. I was afraid you'd send me back home." She sniffled loudly as she admitted why she hadn't told him the truth. "I may have," he said. "We'll make it work, though." He continued mixing the bread, picking up the pace a little. They'd slept later than they would have if he'd known he'd be doing the majority of the cooking alone. He'd have to work harder to have everything ready by the time the restaurant opened. He finished mixing the bread and went over to stand beside her, carefully dumping the eggs into a slop bowl. "We give all of our scraps to one of the pig farmers outside of town, and he feeds his pigs with them. In return, he gives us a reduced price for the slaughtered pig when the time comes." She nodded. "I'm sorry I messed up the eggs." She looked down, unable to meet his gaze, because she knew she'd see disappointment in it. He didn't know yet how good she was with people. "It's fine." He turned to the stove. "The pan is hot enough now, so let's start the bacon." He laid the bacon across the pan and she heard the sizzle. Then he turned back to the bowl she'd used to mix the eggs. After checking that there were no pieces of shell left, he cracked 6 eggs into it, using just one hand. She watched carefully, knowing she wanted to be able to do it herself the next day. She should have paid better attention when Berta was trying to teach her. "I want you to mix this together." He handed her a fork. "Hold the bowl against your belly with your arm and mix it fast with the fork." He watched her for a moment, before he nodded and walked to the stove to turn the bacon. "Always cook the bacon first, because then you can use the grease to cook the eggs. If you're not making bacon or sausage with your eggs, use butter or a little lard to grease the pan." She nodded, listening to every word. She needed to get into the mindset that she could cook, and she needed to learn from him as quickly as she could. He hadn't yelled at her or berated her for lying to him, but he should have. She hated that she'd let him down in something so important. Why hadn't she listened to Berta? He took the bowl from her. "I'm going to add just a little bit of salt and pepper now, and we'll be ready to cook the eggs. I'm going to let you cook them. The important thing when you scramble eggs is not to let any part of the egg stick to the pan for too long. You need to keep mixing the eggs around while they cook. All right?" He used a tone of voice that he would use with a child he was teaching. He tried not to let his upset show in his tone of voice, because she was obviously already humiliated. She nodded. I can do that. At least she hoped she could. She'd do her very best. He took the bacon out of the pan while she took a spoon and carefully stirred the bacon, just as he'd said. He watched her a bit but seemed satisfied that she was doing it right. While she cooked the eggs, he mixed up a crust for a pie later. Do you know how to peel and core apples? He asked. He hoped there were some things she could do in the kitchen, because he needed her to help him even if it was just the little things. I've done that before. She preferred to eat apples peeled and cored, and her mother had to let the cook do it for her, insisting that if she wouldn't eat the fruit in its natural state, then she should have to do it herself. All right. I'll have you do that after breakfast. He nodded to the eggs. They're done now. Use your apron to shield your hand and move them off the stove onto that towel there. He pointed to the towel he'd set down for her to use. That's perfect. He handed her 2 plates. Divide the bacon between the plates and put half the eggs on each. Pour us each a cup of coffee and set everything on the table there. We'll eat. He was pleased with her first lesson. She'd done very well. She noticed for the first time a small table for 2 in the corner of the kitchen. Is that where we'll eat all of our meals? She asked. She was used to eating in a formal dining room with the family's cook serving them, but she could get used to eating at the small table. It felt intimate to her, and she liked the idea of being so close to her new husband. Most of them anyway. He watched as she did as she was told and walked over to sit across from her. He took her hand in his as he prayed for them both, and then picked up his fork, taking a small amount of the egg and tasting it. That's good. She smiled, thankful she'd at least done that right. She squeezed his hand before picking up her fork. Thank you for not getting angry with me. She knew she didn't deserve his understanding, but she was thankful to have it. Eventually, she'd help the whole town out, and he'd see that her lack of cooking skill was a minor flaw. He took a sip of his coffee, watching her over it. I'm disappointed. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't. It really hurts me that you'd lie to me, but there's not much either of us can do about it now other than make the best out of the situation. His words came out harsher than he'd intended them to, and he immediately felt badly. When she looked down at her plate, he knew he had hurt her feelings, but she needed to know he wouldn't put up with lies. I care for you, and we're going to make things work out between us. In a few weeks, you won't be lying when you say you can cook. In the meantime, you're going to have to do the little jobs around the restaurant that don't involve a great deal of cooking. He shrugged. We'll make it work. He would make certain of it. She nodded, still not able to meet his eyes. She took a bite of the eggs and looked up in surprise. They are good. I made eggs. She said the words as if she'd climbed a mountain or finished painting a masterpiece. He smiled, enjoying her enthusiasm. If she wanted to be able to cook as much as she seemed to, she'd be good at it in no time. I told you they were. He was thrilled to see her so pleased with herself. After breakfast, she washed the dishes, while he prepped food for the day. When she was finished with the dishes, he gave her a huge basket of apples to peel and core. We also need them sliced, but I'll show you how I want that done when you're finished. He preferred thin slices of apple, almost as thin as a sheet of paper, because he felt it helped the other seasonings flavor the apples better. They worked together mostly in silence as they prepped for their day. He would have her watch when there was something he wanted her to be able to do. When she finished with the apples, he walked around behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. You're doing a great job, he said encouragingly. He showed her how thin he wanted the apples sliced, and she went to work on that. He showed her how to put the apples into the crust and the right amount of sugar and spices to add. There, now you can mostly make an apple pie. He added the top crust and popped the first of the pies into the oven. They worked well together, and he realized that she was more than capable of doing most of what he needed done in the restaurant as long as he was willing to keep cooking. Of course, he had wanted her to take over all the cooking, so he could concentrate on baking and open a bakery as part of the restaurant, but that could be put off while she learned to cook. By the time the restaurant opened, she already had a few tendrils of hair escaping from her bun, and he loved it. He caught her face in his hands and kissed her quickly before walking to the front of the restaurant to flip the sign from closed to open and unlock the door. This would be the real test for her. Would she be able to keep up with the customers if she couldn't keep up with the cooking? He usually did both, because the restaurant was small. They'd see. Chapter 5. From the time they opened at 10:30 to they closed again at 2, they were swamped with customers. Millie was in and out of the kitchen taking plates to people, but she never got an order wrong. She introduced herself sweetly to every person who walked in, and offered them all apple pie at the end of their meal. "I made it myself," she told them all, stretching the truth a little. Most of the customers were ranchers or their hands coming into town to get something or someone from the train. Connor had been right about that. Several times she was asked if she had a husband, so she finally started introducing herself as Millie O'Reilly. The name sounded strange even to her. She wondered how long it would take for her to get used to the new name. Just before they closed at 2, she walked up to a table, taking her pencil from behind her ear where she'd tucked it. "Hi, I'm Millie O'Reilly. I'll be your waitress. What can I get you today?" She smiled, asking the question sweetly. She'd been surprised at the tips she was receiving from the customers. The man looked her up and down as if she wore nothing, and she wanted to hide behind something. "You marry Connor?" Millie nodded. "Just yesterday." She was pleased to be able to say she was married, because the man made her feel very uncomfortable. He obviously needed a wife, but it couldn't be her. "You don't need him. Run away with me." Millie couldn't believe he'd even suggested it. "I believe in the sanctity of marriage." She stared at him as if he were a rodent. "What can I get you today?" She refused to think about anything else. He looked up at the chalkboard where she had written the menu for the day. "I'll take the roast and a glass of iced tea." "I'll get it for you." She walked into the kitchen and happily shut the door behind her. "There's a man out there that's looking at me like he wants to eat me for lunch," she told Connor, shuddering. Connor walked over to the door to the dining area and looked out. "That's John Bennett. He's a rancher just outside of town. He's okay once you get to know him. For now, anytime he comes in here, you let me know, and I'll serve him." She nodded, thankful for his answer. "He wants the roast and iced tea. You plate it, and I'll take it out to him." He'd been working with her on the correct way to plate meals for the customers throughout the morning. At first, he'd done it for her, but gradually, he'd made her start doing it all herself. She carefully put 2 pieces of meat, the amount of mashed potatoes he'd shown her, and a spoonful of carrots onto a plate, added 2 slices of the fresh bread, and poured a glass of iced tea. She handed both to Connor. "Thank you for taking care of him." Connor kissed Millie over the food. "You don't have to deal with people who make you uncomfortable." He went out the swinging door and put the food down in front of the man, who was the only person left in the restaurant. "Here you go." He stood over the rancher after setting his food on the table in front of him, waiting for the other man to ask him about Millie. "What happened to your pretty little wife? I thought she was going to bring me my food." John seemed annoyed that he'd been served by Connor instead of Millie. "It's time for her lunch break." Connor walked back toward the kitchen. "You let me know if you want anything else," he called over his shoulder. "I'd rather have the pretty girl serve me." "You'll need to go somewhere else for that. I'm sure you can find a saloon somewhere. My wife is eating her lunch." He walked back into the kitchen. Eat. But I was going to wait for you. I want to wash the dishes now, so we can eat together. She hated the idea of eating without him. I told him you were taking your lunch break, so you need to eat. She sighed. I guess I'm eating lunch then. She looked at what was left, and served herself a huge bowl of the chicken and dumplings. She hadn't eaten since early that morning and was starving. She took 2 slices of bread and buttered them before walking to the table and sitting down. She watched as Connor got a bowl of the chicken himself and added bread, walking to sit across from her. I'm not going to let you eat alone, he told her with a smile. As soon as they were finished, Connor went to check on John. You want anything else? What kind of pie you got today? Apple. I'll take a piece and a cup of coffee. Millie heard the conversation and had the pie and coffee ready for him when he came in. He nodded his thanks and took it back out to the other man. I'll have your bill ready in a minute. He spent a minute on the bill and took it back out. Now when I leave my tip today, I want that pretty wife of yours to get it and to know it's from me. Connor nodded. I'll tell her. When he walked back into the kitchen, she was on her feet in front of the sink washing the last of the lunch dishes. She'd done her best to keep up with them throughout the day. He couldn't have been more pleased with her. It was obvious she wasn't used to hard work, but she had jumped right in and done everything that needed to be done. How could he complain about that? Together, they cleaned the kitchen from the lunch crowd and started preparing the food for supper. Supper's a bit harder, Connor explained. At lunch we have 3 meals for them to choose from, and they pick one. It's that simple. At supper, we have those same 3 meals, but we add steak, which we cook to order, and baked chicken. Millie listened eagerly, nodding. So for supper, we'll do the chicken and dumplings, beef stew, and roast beef, but we'll also have steak and baked chicken. Got it. She would learn to do everything just the way he wanted it done so that she could please him. Never in her life had she wanted to please anyone as much as she wanted to please Connor. He smiled. We do mashed potatoes as a side with both the chicken and the steak. He pointed to a small mountain of potatoes. Have you ever peeled potatoes? He'd done them that morning while having her do other tasks. She'd watched as much as she could, but she'd needed to concentrate on what she was supposed to be doing. She shook her head, staring at the huge pile. Is it much different from apples? Not terribly. Peel them, cut them into small chunks, and throw them in a pot of water. Then we'll boil them. He explained the process as succinctly as he could, knowing she would follow his directions after working with her for half a day already. Do we serve the same things every day? She hoped so, because she could learn to make the meals faster if they did. He nodded. I change up the dessert every day, but that's about it. She walked to the sink and grabbed a potato. Let's get started then. She was eager to do everything he needed her to do and do it right. They reopened for supper at 5 and closed at 7. She was amazed at how much work was involved in serving meals for only 5.5 hours per day. The dinner crowd was much smaller than the lunch crowd had been, and Millie was thankful. Her feet hurt by the time they closed, and they still had a small mountain of dishes to do. She went to the sink and washed them quickly, without a word, wanting to get done so she could go to sleep. Nothing had ever sounded as good as sleep did in that moment. She knew she'd eventually get used to the hard work, but just then, it didn't feel like it. You look exhausted, he said as he wrapped his arm around her to walk back up the stairs to their room. She nodded. I've never worked so hard in my life. He smiled, squeezing her tightly. Did you have a job at home? She shook her head. I was a wastrel. I volunteered at the orphanage on occasion, but I just sat holding the babies. I didn't do any real work. She hated admitting it, But she wasn't about to lie to him after the way he'd reacted to her not being able to cook. "How old are you?" He couldn't believe he didn't know how old his own wife was, but he had to ask. 22. She frowned, knowing it had sounded like she'd wasted a lot of time doing nothing. "My parents didn't think women should work." "Really?" He raised an eyebrow. "What does your father do?" "He owns a restaurant and hotel." "Just like you do." "And he employed no women?" Millie frowned. "He had a lot of female employees." I guess what he really meant is that he didn't think his daughters should work. She'd never thought about his double standards before, but it was clear to her then that she should have. Connor laughed, shaking his head. "Did he know that you'd be working with me?" "I left that out when I told him I was coming out here to marry you." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Oh, I almost forgot. I'm supposed to write 3 letters as soon as I arrive so everyone knows I'm all right." She hated that she hadn't done it the previous day. She didn't want the people she cared about worrying about her. "Tomorrow. Tonight, you need to just get ready for bed. We'll have an early day again tomorrow." Watching her, he realized he may be asking too much from her. She wasn't used to working at all, and he was suddenly asking her to work 14-hour days. He wasn't sure she was ready for it. Of course, once they were working together better, the amount of time it took to prepare would be cut way down. They both undressed quickly and climbed into bed. He pulled her into his arms, and she put her head on his shoulder. She was too tired to make love, and he knew it. He sighed. They always had tomorrow. Maybe he'd need to start closing the restaurant 1 day a week to give her time to rest. He watched her for a few minutes as she slept, wondering why he wasn't angrier with her for lying to him. He guessed he understood in some ways why she'd done it, but it had certainly ruined his plans for the bakery. Maybe that was a good thing though. He closed his eyes, curled around her. Today had been rough, but it could only get better from there. Right? Chapter 6. When Connor woke her the following morning, she was certain she'd never be able to get out of bed and start working. She just didn't have it in her. Her feet hurt, and her back hurt, and she felt like she'd never be able to move again. She took one look at his face, though, and knew she couldn't disappoint him again. She had no desire to let him down the way she already had. She needed to do everything she could to prove to him that she could make it work. She crawled from the bed, feeling like death warmed over, but did her best to hide it from him. "I'm going to make breakfast this morning," she announced, "and I'm going to do it right." She felt as grumpy as she always did first thing in the morning, but she did her best to hide it. He grinned, kissing her softly. "That's my girl. I know you can." They went down the stairs and into the kitchen of the restaurant, and she immediately went into the cold room for the eggs and bacon while he started the fire in the stove and then started to mix up the dough for bread. She carefully heated the pan and then added the bacon before she mixed the eggs. This time she managed to break the eggs without getting a single shell in them. She added the milk and mixed it, then turned the bacon. She added the salt and pepper to the egg mixture and mixed it a little more before removing the bacon from the stove. She carefully poured the eggs into the frying pan and stirred them the same way she had the previous morning. They looked like they were right. She prayed they tasted good. She plated both of their meals and poured out their coffee, carrying it to the table. He prayed for them, and she watched as he took his first bite of eggs. He smiled and nodded at her. "These are delicious." He could tell she was anxious and was thrilled to be able to truthfully compliment her cooking. She breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you." She took a bite and smiled. He hadn't lied. She'd actually done it right. "I made a whole meal by myself." Yes, she knew it was a simple meal, because it was the first one that Berta tried to teach her to cook, but she didn't care. A meal was a meal, and she'd done it right. It's quite an accomplishment. He squeezed her hand in his. I'm glad you were the one to come out here and marry me. He realized that was the truth. She had lied about something that he'd considered extremely important, but she was a hard worker and willing to learn, and that was the most important thing. Me too. I appreciate the man you are. I don't know of any other who would have been all right with the lie that I told. She took a sip of her coffee. Back in Beckham, the lie seemed like nothing. I thought, oh, he won't mind. He's getting a wife after all. Berta tried to teach me to cook before I left, but I only had one day to try to learn, and honestly, I didn't think you'd care that much. She looked down at her lap as she said the words, knowing they would bother him, but needing to tell him everything. He frowned. I care more about the lie than your inability to cook. I understand that you didn't feel it was important, and I'm not angry with you, but I do ask that you don't lie again. He watched her carefully, wondering how she'd respond. She shook her head. Having the lie come out the way it did was mortifying. I learned my lesson. She would never lie to him again. She couldn't keep hurting him that way. He had been thinking hard about what they could do to change things, so that life wouldn't be so hard on her here, and he had an idea, but he wasn't going to bring it up just yet. When she got what she needed to do down, then they'd talk about it. Asterisk. For Millie, all the days blended together. She worked from the time she woke in the morning until she went to bed at night, with little respite. The only day that was different was Sunday, and it was only different because they had to get up a little earlier to open the restaurant a little later. She felt like she was constantly cooking, but she learned, and she learned well. By her third Monday of marriage, she was able to do all the regular cooking on her own, while Connor did the baking. She was so proud of herself for her accomplishments that she was all but dancing. She not only cooked all the meals that day, but she also served every single customer. Connor watched her carefully, nodding his encouragement. At the end of the day, while they were eating their supper, he told her his idea. I think we should start having the restaurant only open for the lunch rush. He knew she hated the long hours, and he expected her to be excited. She stared at him in surprise. But I finally learned that I can do it. Did he think she couldn't handle the fast pace of running a restaurant? He nodded. You can do it. Here's my thinking on the matter, though. I didn't mind working 14-hour days when I was a single man, but now that I'm married, I want more time with my wife, and I don't want to see my wife work herself into an early grave. I know many women work those hours, but I don't want you to have to. He thought about her father never allowing her to work, and how as soon as he married her, she was forced to do nothing but work. She nodded, before asking, but don't we need the money from the dinner hour? How would they make it with the big loss of income? He was right, and well over half of their income from the restaurant was made at lunchtime, but surely they needed the supper income as well. Especially if they were going to get a house together someday. He shook his head. Not with my idea. 1/4 of our income comes from the hotel. That will remain steady regardless. 3/4 of what's left of the income comes from our lunch rush. That's very little money that's coming in from supper time. I think we should close during supper, and instead, I will start baking and selling my baked goods. We'll work from 6 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, instead of from 6 in the morning until 8 or 9 at night. We'll still put in a good day's work. The bakery should more than make up for the lost income from closing at supper time, and should even bring in more money. She thought about his suggestion for a moment. When would you want to start this? She liked the idea of working shorter days. She would do what was necessary, but having more time with her husband would certainly be a welcome change. Well, I think 1 more week of this, but we'll post on the door that the new hours will start on Monday of next week. We'll also post about the baked goods starting Monday of next week. People are always asking to buy my pies, and we never have enough. That way I could do custom cakes as well." He grinned, liking the idea of being able to use his creativity on cakes. "I like the idea. In fact, I love it." She took his hand across the small table. "My favorite part is getting to spend extra time with my husband." She wound her fingers through his, smiling at him as their eyes met. He brought her hand to his lips. "I like that part too." He wrote up a sign that they put on the front door, letting people know of the new hours and the bakery hours. Most people who talked to them were very excited about it, and they started making a list of the types of baked goods people in the town wanted. Through it all, Millie constantly worried that Connor wished it had been Berta to come to him instead of her. Oh, she knew he enjoyed their time in bed together, but he'd have enjoyed time there with Berta as well. And Berta would have been a great deal better in the kitchen. She knew she needed to do something to show him how good she was at helping people, and that she wasn't inferior to Berta. She wasn't even inferior to the perfect Berta who lived in his head. It was while she was in the lobby of the hotel one evening that it came to her. Poor widow Sanders had 2 small children, and her husband had been killed by someone trying to steal their land just a few months before. She sat one evening and talked to the widow for hours, working the details of her plan out in her mind. "Will you come to lunch at the restaurant tomorrow?" she asked. "Come around 2, and I'll feed the children in the kitchen so you can have a nice quiet meal for a change." John Bennett was there just before 2 every afternoon for his lunch, and Millie was convinced he and widow Sanders would be perfect for one another. John wanted a wife. Widow Sanders needed a husband and father for her children. Her boys were 5 and 7, and they were the wildest, most out-of-control boys Millie had ever seen. Of course, she thought of John Bennett when she looked at them. "Yes," Mary Sanders responded, nodding. "I'd be happy to do that." She seemed pleased at the invitation. Millie thought the other woman looked terribly tired all the time, and she wanted to help her, so she decided to make her a project. It would work out perfectly, just like all her plans did. Look how her plan to come to Idaho and marry him had worked out. She'd done well. She was happy to have found a way to show Connor that he'd been right to marry her. He would sing her praises once she found a good husband for the sweet widow.